The reaction of the English. Do you ever hate that? The reaction of English labor. Hamon's view of the sort of concern that focused the minds of the laboring class as they came face to face with the dislocations of the industrial labor is in part substantiated by the political and social movements among the underclass that so distressed the upper middle classes of the earliest moments of this period. That sounds like right now, where people are like, hey, F the system, break it down, and people are like, oh, but our privileged lives. But our lives in the industrial core. But what do you mean? And people are like, it's bad. Capitalism bad. Unemployment bad. Poor working environment bad. Death bad. And they're like, but what? But I see no death. But it's like, but well, why don't you open your eyes? They working us. They ain't working you. No. That's what that is. Thank you for my rendition, for listening to my rendition of what that is. Not really. That's not the best one. It's like literally right now where people are like, hey, our lifestyle, the way that we're living is actually contributing to like mass atrocity and violence worldwide, and we want better for everybody. And they're like, but we're privileged. What do you mean? I don't see my life's great. And it's like, well, yeah, you live in the industrial core. It's supposed to be great. You're supposed to be asleep. Wake up. They're like, but what? What do you mean? Why can't I just donate to a charity? And write it off on my taxes? And they're like, well, why do you even have taxes if it's not? If it's just we can have a you know. In 1831, James Mill had written to an associate, nothing can be conceived more mischievous than the doctrines which have been preached to the common people. One quite obvious expression of working class anger towards the impoverishment of their social lives, and as Hammond calls it, imagination, capitalism kills imagination, is the movement to which Hobson refers as the machine breakers. Distinguishing between those movements where attacks on private property and machinery were tactics designed to force concessions from employers, and those movements energized by workers concerned not with the technical progress in the abstract, but with practical twin problems of preventing unemployment and maintaining the customary standards of life, which include non-monetary factors such as freedom and dignity. They said, but we's human. But they're like, oh, but no, you work at McDonald's. Just as a reference in terms of how people talk about, I'm not me saying, right, I'm just trying to use an example. Oh, they like work at McDonald's, blah, 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 blah. But it's like, but I'm still a human. My job doesn't determine my value as a human and my freedom and my dignity. Oh, but you work at McDonald's. And where do you work? And you go to McDonald's. What does that say about you? Are they less of a human? No. You know what I mean? Like, have you ever heard of that? Like, oh, well, these homeless people are lazy. Why? These homeless, they don't deserve housing. Why? You know what I mean? Like that type of rhetoric. Oh, it's black people's fault for the conditions that they're in. Hobsbawm linked the revolts that echoed the ideals initially recorded among the Spitalfields weavers in 1675. Hobson tells us of the successive generations of weavers in Spitalfields rioting in 1719 against wearers of printed calicos. Okay. In 1736 and again in the 1760s against machines in the 1778 through 80. Machine breakers appeared in Lancashire. Ludism, proper appearance in 1802, peaked in the 1811-1813 period, spinning jennies before largely disappearing after the suppression of the farm labor machine breakers in 1830 in the southern counties, in East Anglia and the Midlands. More interesting, these Luddite movements was not only reflected a resistance to the machine as a tool of capitalist production on the part of the workers, but also served to reveal the existence of a broader social hostility to capitalist industry. The fully developed capitalist entrepreneurs formed a small minority. The small shopkeepers or local masters did not want an economy of limitless expansion, accumulation, and technical revolution. His ideal was the secular dream of all little men, which has found periodic expression in leveler, Jeffersonian, or Jacobin radicalism, a small-scale society of modest property owners and comfortably off-wage earners without great distinctions of wealth or power. It was an unrealizable ideal, never more than in the most rapidly evolving societies. Let us remember, however, that those to whom it appealed in early 19th century Europe made up the majority of the population and outside such industries as cotton of the employing class. Girl, you know you better watch out. It's like these guys just keep taking and taking. These big corporations versus small businesses. That's what that's saying to me. A more critical confirmation of Hamon's thesis on the significance that must be attached to the subversion of the social and cultural integument, a feudal society is Britain by the imposition of industrial production, is suggested elsewhere. It would appear that the ideological and social response of the English working classes to the imminent domination by a new social order was not restricted to class-specific or economic behaviors. The class consciousness of English workers did not strictly adhere to the logic of working class formation premised on capitalist exploitation and modeled by Marx from the histories of the French and English bourgeoisie. Indeed, a more profound reaction to an industrial capitalist order found among English producers in the 18th and 19th centuries largely deterred those political and social consequences of proletarialization which had already become the dogma of English radical thought and expectation in years immediately following the Great Revolution of France. The development of Anglo-Saxon chauvinism, the earliest form of English nationalism, and the appearance of rather extreme forms of racism among the English working class determined the form of the characteristics that English class consciousness assumed, meaning it was not just class, it was also race. Racism, Anglo-Saxon chauvinism is what also determined class consciousness. Because we live in a racial capitalistic society, you can't just look at things as class. And he's saying that we have to look at, because like in the earlier part, when we go back to the beginning, it said, okay, E.P. Thompson, based on what you said about the working class made itself as much as it was made, I'm going to take your word for it when you also said racialism was a part of this too. Based on what you said. That's what he's talking about. The parochialisms of ethnocentrism excuse me. Girl, It's my book. I can cough on it. Now no one will touch it. The parochialisms of ethnocentrism and race hostility constituted a response that was both a native and a consequence of the loss of pre-capitalist social integration. Highlight it. Okay, I'm gonna turn my light on now because the sun is setting. Ooh. Hold up. People can see in my room now. I wish I could edit YouTube videos so I could put dancing music, but to pretend there's music. But yeah, I don't know how to edit. I'm just recording videos on my camera. I don't know the editing software or nothing. Okay. Of the first Anglo-Saxon chauvinism, George Rood would note, one of the most remarkably persistent beliefs of all was that perfect liberties had existed under the Saxon kings, and these had been flinched, together with their lands, from free-born Englishmen by the invading Norman knights under William the Bastard in 1066. 1666. 1066. 1066. The myth of the Norman yoke persisted until Chartist times in 1840s and was handed down by generations of levelers, Whigs reared on revolution principles, London 18th century radicals, and Democrats nurtured on the more recent doctrines of popular sovereignty and the rights of man. These were like essential to the Anglo-Saxon ideology. The existence of this constantly recurring theme of popular ideology in English social history eventually took the form of nationalism, being like, you know how they'll be like American values, but the American values are based off of Anglo-Saxonism. That's what that's saying to me. But more particularly as a nationalism incorporating virulent xenophobia. That's going to go in the notes. I put it in. It's like the discrimination of those outside of your country. The processes behind the appearance of a racially conscious working class nationalism requires some more rather close attention, if for no other reason than that they had been obscured in radical English histories written appropriately as responses to work less sympathetic to and less comprehensive of the conditions and struggles of the English industrial working class. Girl. If for no other reason than that they had been obscured, so they was lied, they was hidden, in radical English histories written appropriately as responses to works less sympathetic to and less comprehensive of the conditions and struggles of the English industrial class, they was ignored. English society was the first to have developed an industrial proletariat among its working classes. Yet, well before the peaks of Luddite and Chartist protests, and during the heyday of the earlier Owenite socialism, the supranationalist class identity that Thompson has noted among English workers, and the heroic culture, you know, like the hero's journey. The sky is so beautiful. You know, the hero's journey? It's pink and blue and purple. And how it's kind of like supremacy coded. Manifest destiny. coded. Yeah, once you see the patterns be patterned and they don't stop patterning. Okay. Had noted among English workers and the heroic culture they produced between the French Revolution and the defeat of Chartism, which demonstrated its while demonstrating its erratic course, had begun to its retreat before proto-nationalism. This is one aspect of the lost vision of the English working classes in the 1830s, and one that Thompson was forced to reluctantly recognize. It is easy enough to say that this culture was backward-looking or conservative. True enough, one direction of the great agitations of the artisans and outworkers, continued over 50 years, was to resist being turned into a proletariat, like right now. When they knew that this cause was lost, yet they reached out again in the 30s and 40s and sought to achieve new and only imagined forms of social control. Okay. It would appear in the mid 1860s, but by then that would become the general labor union movement, replacing an earlier and explicit consciousness of a class struggle for political power. And so, union movement, general labor union movement, had so progressed as to be so much under the sway of labor bureaucrats that not even the direct intervention of Marx was sufficient to more than briefly deflect English working class consciousness from nationalism. That will be in the notes. Despite the evidence that in 1864, the year of the founding of the International Working Men's Association, the IWMA, or First International, spokesmen for British labor addressed themselves publicly to what Royden Harrison characterizes as the National Liberation and Unification Movement in America, Italy, and Poland. By 1871, the more persistent thrust of trade unionism was more dominant. By 1871, Marx was opposed to an attempt at a proletarian revolution in Paris, but when it was made, his loyalty to the working class and its own past record left him no choice but to give it his unflinching support. He said, "Fine, you have it." By identifying the International with the Commune, Marx occasioned the break with the majority of English labor leaders and sealed the fate of the IWMA, a course of action from which there was no honorable release. Marx and the English trade union workers disowned each other. The formulation of an explanation for the revival and dominance of trade union consciousness among the English working class is not a simple task. For one, it must take into account what Thompson terms the counter-revolution of the dominant classes. That struck such divisive blows at the working class radicalism in 1834 and 1835 and 1848. It must also encompass the historical process by which the industrial forms of production were established in England, including the patterns of labor recruitment from the villages and countryside of England, and subsequent forms of work discipline established to proletarianize the recruits. There are so many black people that live near me, and I am so happy. And I offered to babysit. I love kids. I love working with kids. They're very easy to understand to me most of the time. And they're kind and they're smart. And if you're kind to them, they're kind to you, and that's all I hope to do. And the divisions of labor. Okay, let me go back because I started talking. Oh my gosh. And the subsequent forms of the work discipline established to proletarianize the recruits, and the divisions of labor that characterize the international structures of structure of British capitalism. But perhaps most important to the understanding of the evolution of working class nationalism in Britain, and more, the issue here is the role another nationalism, Irish nationalism, played in the formative period of English working class development and its concomitant construction of English working class culture. Moreover, the part played by English workers in the revolts of English labor in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, being the social and historical expression of Irish nationalism, must also be noted.